Welcome to the Peace Channel. My name is Mel Lehman. I'm the Director of Common Humanity. It's a peacemaking organization which seeks to build respect, friendship, and understanding between people around the world and people here in the States. We really don't get much of a good picture of the rest of the world. We get little snippets here and there on the evening news before the headache commercials start and the local news begins, so we see so little of the world. So we make an effort to reach out and see other parts of the world. Much of what we see is the Middle East, but today we're taking it a little bit further, and we have two guests who are going to tell us about Laos. And welcome to Titus Peachey and Linda Gehman Peachey. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Let me tell you a little bit about our guests. First of all, let me tell you that they're personal friends. I went to school with Titus and Linda, and we had a great time together at school. But since then, they've been quite busy since school at Eastern Mennonite University. Titus Peachey worked for Mennonite Central Committee for 35 years. Titus is now retired and volunteers with a number of peace-related projects, including Legacies of War, the GI Rights Hotline, and the Lancaster, Pennsylvania chapter of the NAACP. Linda Gehman Peachey is a freelance writer living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, my hometown. She has a Master's of Divinity degree from Anabaptist Mennonite Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, and a Doctor of Ministry from Lancaster Theological Seminary. Previously, Linda worked for Mennonite Central Committee on women's concerns and also served with her husband, Titus, here as co-director of Peace and Justice Ministries. They also worked with Mennonite Central Committee in Laos from 1981 to 85. Linda and Titus have two adult daughters that they are very much looking forward to seeing soon. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We spend a good amount of time talking about the beauty of the rest of the world. We're going to see some of the pain and struggle that has happened, tragedy that has happened, and rebuilding from Laos. But we're first going to see some beautiful images of the beauty of Laos. I think that's a good way to start. How did you get interested in Laos?
Well, I had worked previously in Vietnam for 3 years as a conscientious objector during the war, and so was always drawn back toward that part of the world, and was also really interested in knowing what happened kind of on the other side of the war. And Laos, by the time we went, had become, the revolution had changed the government into a communist government, and so it was an opportunity to see what people had experienced on the other side of the US military intervention, not only in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. So when the opportunity that MCC presented came up, we went for it.
Right. Yeah, we were fortunate in being able to go to Laos, actually. Yeah, we were interested in work with MCC, and this position came open. Yeah. So.
Well, let's go to screen share and get a picture of our map, I think is our first image there, which will help to get us located there. If you could take a look there.
All right.
Okay.
There's Laos, right next to Vietnam and Thailand.
Right. Yeah, we thought we'd start with showing you where Laos is. And as Mel said, Vietnam is to the east and Thailand is to the west of Laos. It's a landlocked country. And then there's Cambodia to the south, and China and Myanmar to the north and northwest. So as Mel said, there's a lot of beauty in Laos. And so here you see mountains and rice paddies, just gorgeous landscapes. There are also wonderful rivers that we were able to travel on while we were in Laos. Much of the country is very rural, and people live in very simple villages with houses made out of bamboo and thatched roofs. This when we were in Laos many, many years ago, this was one of the streets that we traveled on into the main part of the capital city. The capital city was also very, one could say, very rural at that time. It was kind of a series of villages. Of course, much has changed in the last 40 years. There are Buddhist temples and shrines. This is one in the capital city. Much of Laos, especially in the lowland areas along the river, the Mekong River, is Buddhist. And here you see Buddhist monks getting food in the morning. Laos also has a lot of beautiful textiles. People do a lot of their own weaving.
Beautiful.
And they also work together. And here you see efforts to put a house together. A lot of communal labor, people working together, much like an Amish barn raising.
Yeah, when I saw this first, that's what I thought of. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it looks very much like that. And Laos, the old name was Land of a Million Elephants. And so there were a lot of elephants, and some of them are actually used for labor or for doing work, you know, pulling things or carrying things. And here we are 40 years ago in front of the where our house and office were in 1981. So as you can see, much has changed in the last 40 years.
You were in Laos from 81 to 85.
Right, it was 5 years, the beginning of 81 through the end of 85.
Right.
And now we turn to more of the pain that Laos experienced. And one of the things that a lot of Americans did not realize was that the US carried out a secret air war against Laos. And over a 9-year period from 1964 to 1973, they did extensive bombing. And the research shows there were over 580,000 bombing missions over Laos.
Wow.
And if you do the calculations, that's one bombing mission every 8 minutes around the clock for 9 years. I mean, that's sort of averaging all of those out. Of course, it wasn't quite that regular, but it gives you some sense of the amount of bombing that was done. And you can still see very much the after effects of that with the bomb craters in the fields.
I remember the terrible term carpet bombing. What a terrible term, but that was sort of what we're talking about here. Just total obliteration of everywhere.
Yeah, there was, well, and they used a lot of what we'll talk about a little bit later, cluster bombs, which are called area denial weapons. And these were bombs that were designed to scatter over wide parts of the land and keep people out of it. And yeah, you can see here in one of the provinces, yeah, there was so much bombing that there were no permanent structures left standing after the war.
And what was it that?
Go ahead.
What was it that caused the U.S. to be part of this? It seems so crazy now.
Yeah, and especially when you were there, a lot of people really did not understand why the U.S. was doing it. They just felt like America was a country that liked to make war. That was the only way they could explain it. But from the U.S. perspective, Laos was caught up in the U.S. War effort against Vietnam, and also in sort of the proxy war against communism as represented by the Soviet Union and China. Yeah, is there anything else I should say?
Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's how Vietnam sent along that eastern border of Laos, would send supplies from North Vietnam to the south. And so the US was trying to interdict and stop that flow of arms material. And so that was one way it was very, very closely tied to the Vietnam effort or the Vietnam War.
Right, right. Ah,
And so, yeah, I mentioned the cluster bombs, which, yeah, these were large bombs. And after they were dropped from an airplane, they would open up and then these little bomblets would scatter all over the place. And they were specifically designed as anti-personnel weapons. So they were designed to kill or injure human beings, basically. And this was maybe one of the first times that this particular kind of weapon was used very widely. And it was used very, very widely in Laos. And one of the realities is, I mean, and some people feel like maybe the US was actually testing these, that and this success rate wasn't very high. So up to a third of these bombs did not explode as they were designed to. And so what happens is then they were left in the soil, and they can just be found anywhere in trees, and they sink into the soil. And so they're just everywhere in the parts of Laos that were bombed.
mm. They look like mushrooms. They look like some innocuous sort of thing that children would look for.
Yeah, well, and I don't know if you can see this one here. This is in a rice paddy dike. And yeah, so we have the cursor there on it. And they're easily hidden, and people often can walk by and not know that they are there. And of course, like I said, because they can be anywhere, and especially in areas that were not open during, I mean, that were not cultivated during the war, or in the years since, whenever they open up new areas that haven't been cultivated, you know, they're just kind of ever present as a lurking danger, and in the activities of daily life. And so here's a woman hoeing with a traditional Lao hoe. And as you can see, it would be very dangerous if she would hit one of these. It's also a problem if people are digging, like digging posts for houses, or digging to put a road in, or a path, or even holes for bedposts in their houses, or children often too. They, like you said, they're intriguing. And so, and because there are very few toys, you know, you find something that looks like a ball or another strange object, and kids are very curious and pick them up and start playing with it. And so a lot of casualties have happened with children playing with these. And they've had to do a lot of education work in the schools to warn children not to play with these, that these are very dangerous. In 1981, my very first trip in Laos out of the capital city was to Siêng Khoang province. And we were invited to go visit a family where just the day before our trip, or before our visit, a mother had been killed while she was hoeing in a garden, much like you saw earlier, and using a hoe. And so, yeah, it was a very, very tragic event. And this photo was taken by our predecessor, Jan Swartzentrooper, who was also on that trip. And you can see the vestiges of the hoe, and I'll hold this up for now. The family actually gave us the hoe and asked us to take it with us and tell the story so that this stops happening to people. And so, yeah, and I should also say this family had 11 children, and you can see the youngest one there asleep on his sister's back. Such a tragic, tragic story. One of the ways that MCC tried initially to help with this, to help solve this problem, was with a tractor. The thought was that if we design a tractor with some shielding and a chain flail in the front, perhaps we could detonate these bombies by going through fields. as it turns out, that did not work. The chains just sort of would roll the bombies around. And actually, one of the Lao men that was with us when we were testing this, after the chain flail had worked on it, he picked it up and threw it, which was just crazy to do. But he threw it and it went off. So obviously, it was still lethal even after having been beaten by this chain flail. Okay.
So for a period of 20 years, MCC worked in various ways to try to figure out how to resolve this issue. But, we're Mennonites, we're not military people. We have no expertise about bombs and explosive material. And there really were no other agencies or nonprofit groups around that had this expertise until the late 1980s. In 1989, the Mines Advisory Group was formed, which was a British agency that was formed in order to clear landmines from areas that had been mined. And they were working next door in Cambodia. And so in 1993, MCC invited them to come to Laos just to see if they could deal with cluster bombs and help us with that. And so an agreement was worked out between the Mines Advisory Group, Mennonite Central Committee, and the Lao government. And I returned then to Laos for 6 months in 1994 to represent MCC and help lead the formation of this effort. And you can see here the sign in front of the area that would become the headquarters for this project said it was a cooperation project between the government of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and the Mennonite Central Committee with technical assistance from the Mines Advisory Group. So during that 6-month period, we trained 20 Lao technicians on how to use metal detectors, the techniques of mapping, and how to safely find and destroy cluster munitions. This was the first site that was cleared, which became a teacher's training school. And it's a very, very slow, painstaking, and dangerous task because metal detectors often can't really distinguish very well between what's a bomb and what's just a harmless piece of metal. And so that makes it very slow and tedious. But once a bomb is found, the dirt is carefully removed from the bomb, and then explosive material is set on top of it, and it's wired up with long wires. Everybody is moved out of the area, and then an explosive charge is set off, and the bombs are destroyed in place where they're found. It's too dangerous to move them.
I would guess you were scared at times. Were you personally scared?
Well, cluster bombs and landmines are a little bit different in that unless you actually jostle a cluster bomb or mess with it in some way, it's probably not going to blow up just by sitting there. And so I'm quite confident that I probably walked across cluster bombs that were buried beneath me without knowing it. A landmine would have blown up and killed me, but not a cluster bomb, at least usually not.
Yeah.
There were some times in my experimentation with one of the officials from Siêng Quang province, we used to look for cluster bombs, and he got some explosive material from the Soviets, and we would practice how to blow them up. He was a little more free to handle them than I would have felt comfortable with. So there were
You're
times.
not supposed to.
No.
Yeah.
And I have also was with farmers occasionally who would show me their cluster bombs, pick them up and show them to me, which was frightening. So most of the time I was not afraid, but yeah, there were sometimes.
Wow.
In any case, people who clear cluster munitions have to go through training and really observe very strict protocols in order to remain safe.
Mm-hmm.
So scattered throughout the areas that were bombed, there are villages that look very normal, that look very peaceful, and yet lurking in the soil and also hidden in the lives of people, there is trauma that is not always apparent. I mean, we met villagers who had lived in caves for 9 years in order to escape the bombing. One of the women told me, yeah, we lived like rats and mice. We had to crawl to the back of the cave to poop and pee. So you can imagine the horror of that kind of life just in order to stay safe. And then, they would plant rice and then the planes would come and bomb and destroy what they had done. So it was a very, very hard life during those war years. So to walk into these villages as US citizens after the war was a really kind of troubling experience because there were signs of the war still everywhere, including these bomb containers, which we could find in most of the villages. They were used for planters, for herbs, for posts, for granaries, for feeders, for cattle. They were just everywhere. And some of them still carried the tag of the US company that had produced them. So here's one from Camden Manufacturing Company in Camden, Arkansas. And so this was a really troubling reminder of who we were and how we might be identified because of our citizenship, walking into these villages, which, as Linda mentioned earlier, most had no electricity. They did not have a lot of any kind of machinery or mechanical equipment. So it was just really odd and troubling to be in those kinds of settings. And yet, we were welcomed with hospitality and warmth and food, oftentimes stories and songs and laughter. And this happened many times. I don't remember specifically the very first time it happened, but we discovered that oftentimes when we sat down to eat a meal together, the plates, the cups, the spoons, including those that you see pictured here, were made from old bomb casings and dispenser tubes and airplane metal from airplanes. So they had taken the instruments of war that had been designed to kill them and transformed them into instruments of hospitality to offer nourishment and life and well-being to us who were representing the country from which the bombs had come. Now, obviously, they were simply using the materials present in their environment in order to survive. But to us, it was a very striking symbol of the task of being peacemakers. Not only is it something that you do interpersonally, but you also need to transform the systems that are bent on destruction and warfare and violence and transform those systems into things that support life. And that's a huge task, but it became a symbol for us of how we view peacemaking today.
Yeah, we have swords into plowshares and bombs into dishes. What a
That's right.
And thank you for the parts that you were doing for this. Amazing.
Yeah. And so we often wondered, what deep inner work of soul and spirit did these dear people have to go through in order to receive us? We'll never know. We'll never hear. But I'm sure it must have done something. They had to have done something internally in order to receive us that way, even though obviously we came not threatening them, we came in peace, yet still we represented something that had been very harmful. And so you can imagine our surprise, our horror, when we returned to Lancaster County and discovered that there were 2 companies in Lancaster County that were making components for cluster munitions. One of them was located right downtown, you can see pictured here, Boulevard Technologies, and they made components for cluster munitions. So it was like you could connect the dots between the suffering that we saw in Laos and the local economy that provided jobs and a strong tax base for the people of Lancaster, all good things. And yet, on the other side of the world, it represented something totally different. So this was just something that really was troubling and disturbing to us, to see those connections. Again, it spoke to us about systems and structures that need to be addressed. Shifting gears now to 2 other initiatives with that all as background. While we were working in Laos and in other countries at clearing cluster munitions, there were more and more cluster bombs being created and manufactured and used. The US used cluster bombs in the Gulf War, used cluster bombs in the war against Yugoslavia and Kosovo, in the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. And so, you're removing cluster bombs on the one hand, but meanwhile, more cluster bombs are being dropped at a much faster rate than you can remove them. So many of the people in the world that were involved in the campaign to ban landmines said, we got to work on cluster munitions too. And it was about a 10 to 12 year period. I'll just mention the very end of that time period when finally world governments agreed, yeah, we should stop the manufacture and production and use of cluster bombs. And so there was a signing ceremony in Oslo, Norway in December of 2008. I went to several of these meetings, and was just struck by the energy, the creativity, the power of civil society, former landmine ban campaigners, and people who were really concerned about the proliferation of cluster munitions, gathering at these conferences with government leaders and making a strong case for why these weapons need to be banned. And present with them were always people who had personally been injured by cluster munitions. Here you have Siraj on the left from Afghanistan, Berihu in the center from Ethiopia, and Branislav from Yugoslavia on the right, all who had suffered grievously and painfully because of cluster bombs, present at these meetings where there were hundreds of men in suits, explaining to them simply by being present with their bodies, but also being trained in advocacy, why cluster bombs need to be banned because of what they do to individuals and what they do to communities. So it was a very powerful experience to be involved in that. Unhappily, the United States did not participate and still has not signed either the landmine ban or the cluster bomb ban. Another event, series of events which happened, which I was able to participate in, began in 2004 when Chanapa Kamvongsa started the Legacies of War project. She's pictured here in the green, there in the standing in the front row, in Harrisonburg, Virginia, at a presentation at JMU. She learned about this history of her country as a young adult. She came to the US with her parents as a child of age 6 as a refugee, but didn't really know much about the history of this war. And when she learned about it, she became so consumed with needing to do something to rectify the wrong that had happened that she formed this group called Legacies of War. She gathered together Laotian Americans and others. She called me in 2004, and we began to work together. And she began, particularly and then in 2008, to really start to advocate with the State Department and Congress to increase the amount of funding for bomb clearance work in Laos. At that time, the US was spending roughly $2 million a year, $2 to $3 million a year to clear bombs, but they had spent $2 million a day dropping the bombs, which in today's dollars would be more like $13 million a day dropping the bombs, but only 2 to 3 million a year to clear them. So it was just pennies compared to the scale of the problem and what needed to be done. So she began doing a lot of advocacy work, traveling to Laos every year to meet with people on the ground to make sure that she understood the situation there. Some of us board members joined her in 2017. Here we're meeting with the Burlee family in May. And just 6 weeks earlier, their 10-year-old daughter had picked up a cluster bomb on the way home from school, not realizing what it was, brought it into the village, and was playing with it. It dropped, it exploded, it killed her and 12 of her fellow extended family members, pictured here with her parents. So it was a dreadful tragedy. Those kinds of things still happen. There was an accident just, I think in February of this year that killed several children. Here you see the house behind them, partially dismantled. The accident happened right outside their house. They became so traumatized by the event, they said, we have to dismantle our house and go move it to another place. A cousin donated some land for them to build their new house. They had it checked, and demining teams found 30 more bombs in the site where they were going to build the house.
Oh.
So the trauma follows you and stays with you for generations. So we were very pleased then, because of all of our advocacy and the advocacy done also by demining agencies such as Mines Advisory Group, Halo Trust, Norwegian People's Aid. President Obama traveled to Laos in 2016 and pledged $30 million a year over 3 years, total of 90 million, to clear cluster bombs from Laos and provide assistance to people who had been injured. And because of the Legacies of War work, at the end of his speech, he recognized Janapa. He said, Janapa, we thank you for working to fix this problem and for giving attention to it. It was a monumental trip and had great impact on all of us who'd been involved in this work for many years. Casualties have decreased greatly since we began working on this, from over 300 a year to around 25 a year now. And several thousand people are working every day to clear ordnance, bombs. 500 to 600 pieces a day are found and blown up. And that continues as we speak. Here, Legacies of War is celebrating its 15-year anniversary in 2019 at a celebration in Washington, D.C. Here we have Janapa, our founder, on the right, and the new director now, Sarah, on the left, taking up the reins and continuing the work. And we'll close with a picture, Back to Beauty, the Lao national flower, and the address of legacesofwar.org, where you can go and learn lots more about all of these efforts. You can leave a donation if you wish, and we certainly welcome questions. You see the email below, thailand2@gmail.com. So I'll stop sharing the screen now and also hold up this hoe head so
You can see, yeah, turn
see
it
a bit
around.
more
Yeah.
clearly.
Yeah.
Here's where the handle goes, and you can see where it was broken and destroyed there.
Mm-hmm.
So powerful, so strong and touching. And I have no doubt in my mind about being a peacemaker, but this has just like given me some more juice. I mean, we have to stop this. This is just so crazy. And thank you so much for your part in this. And so great to see you as friends. We're pushing towards the end of our half hour. We go over on occasion for moments like this. We're going to go over just a few minutes, but let's see what questions we have. If you want to type in a question, I think there's a couple here. We ask all of our guests one very simple question. What can we do for peace? You have taken us on a remarkable trip and seen some heartbreaking and inspiring images. Most of us aren't going to get to Laos as much as I would like to get there. What can we do right where we are for peace?
Mm-hmm.
You want to start?
Okay. Are you asking specifically about Laos or anywhere?
Anywhere. You can include, well, Legacies of War would be one thing.
Right. Well, Legacies of War, yeah.
Right.
Supporting them is a great way to support peace. I would say when you asked us to think about that question, I think we have become convinced that prevention is just super important. And so advocacy and working to address systems is just crucial because, as you can see, and as Titus emphasized, clearing up bombs after they're dropped is just so painstaking and arduous, and it's hard to imagine that they'll ever be completely clean from Laos. So if we can do things to prevent that kind of suffering, that's really important. I would also say I've become more convinced that working for justice is also a really critical task that we have as peacemakers. Working for fair relationships, fair and just economic and racial relationships. And so ways to be involved in one's community that increase more equity and justice are really critical, I think, to true peace. So those would be some things I thought of. Yeah.
Well, I certainly agree. I'll just be very brief. We all have different skills, backgrounds, experiences, passions. There's not just one model or one format to follow, but think deeply about your own passion and skills and find other people who are working at that issue. Don't do it alone. Get engaged with other agencies, other people in your community, and work together. But the sky is the limit in terms of how you might engage, whether it's war and peace, whether it's violence against women that you want to work at, whether it's racial issues, just so many. So there's no limit.
And they're all interconnected in some way. I mean, that's the other thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's see what questions we have here. Lorraine sends her greetings. Eugene, all the way from Byblos, Lebanon, sends his greetings, and he has a question. Carla says this is so interesting. Let's see yet what Eugene's question is. Thank you for each of those. Eugene writes, does the peace message of Anabaptism, which we experienced during the war in Vietnam, mean anything for us today? What can we learn for global peace in the 2020s?
Wow.
Yeah. Well, it certainly does mean something today. It's a little bit different because the context is different. We no longer have a draft like we did during the Vietnam War. We have a volunteer army. One way, another thing I didn't mention, well, I guess it was mentioned in my introduction. I'm very engaged with the GI Rights Hotline, which means that I talk to active duty soldiers almost every day about issues they're facing, including soldiers who have begun to have some kind of moral questions or ethical concerns about the work in which they're engaged. And so we work with them and within the context of the military regulations to help them find a path out. Or in some cases, it's soldiers who have experienced trauma and moral injury related to their combat experiences, helping them find some kind of inner healing, and a path out is also a part of the GI Rights Hotline work. So even though there's no draft, there still are many ways that we can engage with people who may be deeply affected by war, including soldiers.
Mhm. And I would just say, I think the Mennonite Church USA, has a number of initiatives that with resources on their website that are very important, including working against patriarchy, working to address racism, and also they have a new curriculum about thinking about policing, and should we be thinking about defunding the police, because that's a more domestic way that violence often happens in communities as well. And there's also Mennonites Against Militarism. Yeah, there's an effort. And so they have a lot of initiatives and resources on their website, and some ways that Mennonites continue to address these concerns. War tax resistance is another way to try to work at prevention and address these concerns.
Particularly since people aren't being drafted, needing bodies to go fight as much as needing dollars to create weapons and weapon systems. So war tax resistance addresses that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much. You touched a moment ago on healing moral injury. One of the things that Common Humanity is doing is, one of the artists we work with experienced bombing in Baghdad. And by coincidence, I was there. I didn't know her at the time, but I was there and experienced the very same 4 nights of bombing, but way back in 1998. And we're offering Zoom courses. We visit you and via Zoom and talk about what that was like for a young mother at the time with her children to have American bombs drop. And I can talk as an American what it was like to have Americans bombing me and Muslims helping me. So that's something we're doing at Common Humanity. Just get in touch with us. We would love to come and give you a Zoom webinar live, and you can talk to Lubna. Visit our website, commonhumanity.org. Posters to buy to help the refugee artists help Common Humanity. A contribution to Common Humanity would be great. Come back again in 2 weeks. In 4 weeks, we have a program about Iran. We have an organization called Luke 10, which is providing much needed humanitarian assistance to Iran and building friendships. Thank you so much, Titus and Linda. You look great. You look fabulous. Great to see you both again. Thanks to our viewers. Come back in 2 weeks.